Next up, we have Professor Leah Kalmanson at the University of North Texas. She is the Associate Professor and Bhagwan Adinath Professor of Jain Studies there at the University of North Texas. Welcome, Leah. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope everyone can hear. Um, I do want to say I really enjoyed Brian's talk, and I'm hopelessly double booked today. So I'm really sad that I couldn't catch the entirety of the first panel because it sounds like there's been some really great synergy with this question of non-dualism, and I think I would have benefited from that a lot. So let me make sure can everyone see, or am I sharing my slides?
You are sharing them. It's not in the slide view yet. There, now it is.
Is it there? Okay. All right. Good. Perfect. Um, so this talk today is inspired because I just wrapped up a semester of a graduate class, a graduate seminar on religion and ecology. And one thing I really walked away thinking about this time is like just how much everyone loves to hate dualism. A lot of scholars in the field of religion and ecology, at least the ones we were looking at this semester, sort of converge on this point of rejecting specific dualisms between mind and body, between spiritual and material. They see these dualisms as the root of today's ecological crisis, and they attribute these dualisms specifically, usually, to the legacy of European metaphysics and Christian theology, right? And in place of these dualisms, we get other models, right? Some versions of process philosophy, relational ontology, vital materialism, and which I should say have been my research interest all along as well. So I'm sort of shifting my own research here too. And the attention of some of these scholars in religion and ecology will sometimes turn toward Asian traditions, and many will see these traditions as allies in this project of overcoming dualisms. But one thing I really started to worry about, again, just with what we were looking at this past semester in my class, I get worried the closer we seem to get to a kind of orientalist fascination with the mystic East and its supposed holistic spirituality. And now that I've been working with Jainism more closely over just the past few years, I've also been looking in general at dharmic traditions that classify themselves one way or another as dualistic. And of course, in Jainism, that's expressed when we classify the six fundamentals in terms of living and non-living, or material and non-material. But there's a long list of other positions we could take here, right? The dualism of Sankhya, the dualist Vedanta of Madhvacharya, Ramanuja, right? The non-dualist but differentiated Vedanta, different bhakti yogas. All of these, one way or another, will suggest some way to preserve a distinction between the individual soul and God, or between one soul and another, or in some way to preserve like the distinct reality of the material existence against any kind of encompassing holism. And I think it's fair to say that despite this long list, Shankara's non-dualist Vedanta is by far overrepresented in contemporary English language philosophy, at least in the field I come from in comparative philosophy. Even if you look into intro to philosophy textbooks, specifically the ones that are trying to include a greater diversity of sources outside the European canon, if you look at these, you'll get almost always only two South Asian sources included, or I should say two non-Buddhist South Asian sources, and those will be excerpts from the Bhagavad Gita, which will be so whittled down and decontextualized that it just confuses students. And then it'll be something from Shankara, right? He sort of is the one that represents the entirety of a kind of a Hindu perspective often in these introductory contexts. So I want to begin today talking about the heritage of how this non-dualist position came to be so well represented. I also want to make some comparisons to Chinese traditions, which I think are plausibly closer to the kind of holism that some scholars in religion and ecology are looking for. But my ultimate goal is to show how even that is more complicated than it first appears. So I just wrote a book that is about the overrepresentation of monotheistic issues in the philosophy of religion. So that's part of what's going on in the background here. And part of what I looked into is this question of why, and I love Shankara, he is a compelling thinker, but why Shankara is so overrepresented and someone like, say, Madhvacharya is almost never mentioned, again, in English language scholarship, introductory context, and especially comparative philosophy. And I think the reason goes back to 18th and 19th century Indology in Europe, and a largely evolutionary model of religions that they were proposing, where things begin in quote unquote primitive polytheism and end up in a kind of mystical monism. And again, this is a beloved book. I also love this book, but this is the perspective that is interjected by the editors of this, still authoritative classic text, first published in 1957. And again, the editors here of the source book in Indian philosophy say 3 strata of development are found in the thought of the hymns of the Rig Veda: naturalistic polytheism, monotheism, and monism. Naturalism and anthropomorphism, as indicated in these hymns, seem to constitute the first stage. A striking aspect of the hymns is their polytheistic character. Different views of the spirit of these hymns are held by competent scholars. They have been referred to as primeval, childlike, naive prayers, as the allegorical representation of the attributes of a supreme deity, as sacrificial compositions of a primitive race, which attached great importance to ceremonial rites, as altogether allegorical or somewhat naturalistic. So these underlying assumptions, this evolutionary model, organizes the framework that the editors then use to select and arrange the excerpts from the Vedas. And as they explain regarding their subsections in the source book, the most important of these sections from the point of view of philosophical content is that termed monotheistic and monistic tendencies, where the transition from early polytheism to the more philosophical monism of later hymns is depicted. So they're ranking monotheism and monism, right, as more advanced than polytheism, and then they're putting monism at the apex. So even the single great being of the monotheistic period did not escape criticism. The mind of man is not satisfied with an anthropomorphic deity, and thus monotheism eventually gave way to philosophical monism, the doctrine of the impersonal, unknowable one. So here's a trajectory, right? A pantheon of superhuman entities is whittled down to one superhuman entity and eventually to a depersonalized divinity understood as the rational principle of existence. And there's an obvious framing of a timeline here, but that's not really how history unfolds, right? It's sort of like we're saying to some later philosophers, like, I don't know, Madhvacharya, sorry you didn't get the memo about this being primitive, right? So I'll pause here as a way to start bringing us toward China, to briefly turn to Buddhism, because of course this is the tradition that makes that bridges those discourses, right, between India and China. Buddhist philosophy today, again, I'm kind of thinking in my field, comparative philosophy, English language comparative philosophy, especially Madhyamaka, is undoubtedly associated with non-dualism, but the situation is complicated. Madhyamaka in particular is arguing against an atomistic theory of matter, which was bubbling up in some Buddhist discourses at the time. And the Madhyamakas wanted to deny the claim that any composite form can be reduced to fundamental parts that on their own are irreducible, right? And then that somehow are existing on their own as basic substances, right? So this is where it parts ways with other dharmic traditions, in that it refuses to say that there are these necessary fundamentals, 2, 3, 6, however many, that make up reality, because it's refusing to engage in what, even the early Buddhist discourses, the Pali discourses, are calling speculative views. Buddhism will not assert that anything can be reduced to fundamental substances, whether that's reducing a material form to irreducible atoms or reducing the contingent and temporary person to an irreducible eternal soul. So this gives us the famous non-dualism, right? Given that no one thing exists at all, that there can be no fundamental differences between one so-called thing and another. But the non-dualism here, I think, especially Madhyamaka, that's a byproduct, right, of the larger philosophical critique of a substance metaphysics. So when Buddhism denies dualism, right, it is not thereby asserting monism, right? And so I want building on that, I want to give a sense of continuity from a Hindu text like the Gita straight through to a 20th century East Asian Buddhist. I want to give a sense of the continuity in how important these traditions say it is to differentiate the material from the non-material. And this isn't because they're necessarily asserting dualism as a philosophical theory, but more so because they're saying that this making this distinction is the key to attaining liberation. So we know that in the Gita, right, we have it draws on Samkhya language, philosophy. It talks about subtle bodies. This is the mind, the senses, the intellect. Sometimes this is called the material mind, right? It talks about the gross body, which is the physical form. All of these subtle bodies, gross bodies, the material mind, they're all prakriti, right? They're all material shrouds that obscure the soul. And Krishna's famous advice, right, for liberation, drawn from Sankhya Yoga, is, be like a turtle, right? Withdraw the senses completely from their objects as a tortoise drawing in its limbs. The earliest instructions for meditation in the Buddhist Pali Canon, very similar, right? It is giving us a methodology for withdrawing the mind from sensory contact and disidentifying with both the material mind and the material body. There are many types of Buddhist practices where the material mind is ejected from the body, right? So in Tibetan Poa practice, monks learn how to project their consciousnesses out of their bodies and into the Pure Land. Many Chinese Pure Land practices include similar visualizations and projections. And again, if we jump far forward in time to a 20th century Korean Buddhist nun whom I really like, Kim Il-do. She's a very existential sort of writer at this time period, a feminist Buddhist of this time period. She is relying very clearly in her language on this understanding of the subtle material that makes up the material mind. Human beings, she says, primarily consist of the material mind that senses joy and sorrow. Again, this maps fairly directly onto the same way that the Gita would be describing the material mind and its relation to the senses and sensory inputs. And then finally, this, if anyone is reading, sort of in the sort of East Asian discourses and comparative philosophies, and Master Dogen is a huge deal. He's the paradigm case of non-duality for most people, of a non-dualist philosopher. He refers to Zen practice as just sitting, and letting both body and mind drop away. It's not so different from the Gita's advice to be like a turtle. Everyone likes to talk about this term body mind that Dogen uses because it is a compound term. And he has put it together. It's not often, he puts together a lot of terms, a lot of the Japanese characters in distinct ways. And people read this compound term of his as if it's indicative of some kind of radical body positive non-dualism. But I mean, I think in context, it's just another expression of this idea that this is the material mind body, right? It's all the material set of material shrouds that are obscuring, that are preventing us from attaining liberation, that the mind is part of material reality. And that's part of what we have to let go of if we're to be liberated for Dogen. So at some point in these interactions I've just traced, Buddhism has gone to China and it has met Taoism there. And maybe this does start to get us closer to the kind of non-dualist vital materialism that, like I said, so many researchers in religion and ecology seem to be looking for. In the Indian traditions, we've just seen, these Chinese traditions are also concerned with the difference between what might be called the gross versus the subtle. In the Chinese context, this is usually expressed as a difference between the cloudy and the clear, or the turbid and the placid, or the coarse and the purified. And so there is some stuff here which exists, the basic stuff of existence that can have all these cloudy or clear phases. And this is qi in the Chinese context, right? In its raw state, in its sort of, we could talk about a kind of a cosmic qi, that it's at the origin of things in many Chinese cosmogonic theories. In its raw state, this cosmic qi, this primal qi, is neither matter nor energy. It's neither yin nor yang. It's devoid of distinctions altogether. But part of what it does is it spontaneously generates distinction. So this begins with the initial distinction into yin and yang, and then through future sort of unfolding of interactions, you end up with the myriad things of the cosmos as we know it. And among these things in the cosmos are all different kinds of fine-grained spiritual types. And these are not unlike the different layers of gross and subtle bodies in Indian traditions. All different ways, all different types of sort of spiritual levels here. But there's some differences that I'll note, and this is wrapping it up, three differences here between the Chinese and Indian context that I think could be useful for future conversations and that I'm very interested in having. One is what some researchers in Chinese traditions call the theory of multiple souls in Chinese thought. And soul here really is one term translating like 10 different words, which is part of what I'm indicating on this slide. The basic idea is that the body is a kind of coarse and turbid chi, but it's still vital and generative. And with practice and training and through techniques, it can generate more clarified, purified types of energies. And again, energy is still one word for things that are distinguished in the language in the Chinese, right? But this is part of the practice of something like qigong, right? So something like qigong is vitalizing the body in order to accomplish these transmutations of the physical that then spawn these additional spiritual parts of you. Some of these parts are with us when we're born. Some of the kinds of spiritual souls we can have are generated by us through practice. They can go their separate ways at death. So some might get left behind and function as ghosts around the corpse and they eventually dissipate. Some can go on to reside at ancestral shrines. They could end up in the Buddhist Pure Land again because there's a kind of syncretism of traditions here. But so you have your coarser yin type souls that maybe are more like ghosts post bodily death, and then you have your more advanced, clearer, purer yang type souls that may have a kind of a spiritual afterlife. So whereas in the Jaina context, right, meditation and yoga help you feel that the body is not sentient, right, and not alive, so that you're getting in touch with that one part of you, the soul that is alive, and that is a pre-existing soul, the eternal part of you. Um, and that's different here, right? In the Chinese context, we are drawing instead on the body's vitality. It is very much alive to generate spiritual attainments, indeed to generate souls that may not have been there to begin with. This leads to a second distinction. Unlike in most of the Indian traditions I've talked about at least today, Chinese traditions, I would say, are not so fully invested in asserting the existence of anything purely immaterial. So the various understandings of the soul in Samkhya, in Jainism, and the devotional yogas, these are beyond the realm of materiality altogether, and that's part of the key difference that's made them between the ordinary mind, which is the material mind, and the true soul. I think it's fair to say in Chinese traditions, there are just further and further stages of clarity and purity, right? Qi in increasingly rarefied forms, finer and finer and finer. But theorizing the material non-material distinction isn't really the point. I would say not until the Sung Dynasty under the influence of Buddhism does that actually become an overt question for any Ruist philosopher or Confucian philosopher. So there's a longer conversation we could have about that. And then finally, though, for the sake of time, the last thing I'll say is that there's no theory of karma in Chinese traditions, right, until Buddhism introduces it. China's oldest book, the I Ching, or the Book of Changes, is not about causality; it's about chance, right? It's about what's unpredictable. If you think of a classic Samkhya comment that cream can form on milk but not water, and why is that the case? Because the change is a modification of the constitutive materials in the milk, right? Not a transmutation of milk into new materials. And then this is the Samkhya metaphor for how a single substance, prakriti, gives rise to diverse things. We don't see a similar strict theory of causality in Chinese discourses. It is no accident that a lot of Chinese practices involving causality and change are translated into English as alchemy, right? If Samkhya is assuming a kind of chemistry of Prakriti, traceable changes, we're talking here about an alchemy of chi, right? And this is the third point then, or the last point I'll make. This is also why this is not really a monism, right? Or it's difficult for me to say with confidence this is a monism because, yes, in one sense, everything is chi, in the sense that all things emerge from this initial undifferentiated cosmic chi, but in another sense, changes are real in a way that makes subsequent things truly new and distinct from their source. Again, this is not emergence, but transmutation, not chemistry, but alchemy. I'll end here just with a quote from Michael Puett, one of the few people really making this point out there. He says very directly, quote, the categorization of early Chinese thought as monistic in opposition to the dualistic cosmology of the West breaks down at every level when we explore the historical context and implications of specific statements, end quote. And this is his book, To Become a God, which is precisely a book about generating these deity type souls within yourself by practice. And so that's the level of historical context I think is most useful in comparative work. So many ills have been associated with the dualistic legacy of the so-called West, and I do think that's just too simplistic. I think really digging into the complexities of these various Asian cosmologies and discourse with each other is part of the future work in the field of religion and ecology that will contribute, right, to more complexity in the discourse. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kalmanson, for that. And congratulations on your own new book and for sharing that with us. Congratulations on that. That's wonderful.